John Paul II. So John Paul II is formerly known as Karol Wojtyła, which is a really cool name. He was born in 1920, and in the midst, he was born in Poland in the throes of the World Wars. So put yourself in his shoes for a second. Right? Nietzsche, Marx, all the ideologies, all the philosophies. I'm going to use some big words and I'll try to explain them, but this is going to be, some of you who know TOB is going to be inadequate. Some of you who don't know TOB is going to feel like I'm saying, hey, take a sip out of the end of a fire hose. Right? So I'm going to use some big words. Bear with me. He's born in the 1920s, and he's seeing like the height of communism, of socialism, of world wars going left and right. His mom dies when he's really young. His dad dies before he even makes it through high school. And he sees what happens when man tries to answer the question, who am I, without God? Left and right within society, it's going on, and it leads to great destruction around the world. But what John Paul II eventually does, he's one of the youngest popes elected in, I think, the last 500 or 600 years, at the age of 58, which isn't much older than most of your parents, maybe like give or take 10 years. At 58, he's elected pope, which is a bold move by the church, because a pope can change a lot when he's that young and he's elected. But what we don't know often is what he had just written as a cardinal. So he's made bishop at 38, cardinal at 48, pope at 58. And for the last 10 years prior to him becoming pope, he begins to write what eventually becomes known as TOB, or Theology of the Body. Have you ever seen a book, an encyclical? They're really thin. They're not more than 20 pages usually. And as John Paul II writes this teaching, it's no thin 20, 30-page encyclical. It's about 350 pages long when written out. And what he does is, for the first 5 years of his pontificate, says, hey, I have something I want to teach you about the meaning of your existence. Have you ever thought, why am I here? What am I made for? When you're sitting in your room scrolling through your Instagram feed or keeping your Snapchat streaks going, right? Has there ever been that moment where you're like, there's got to be something more? There's got to be more than this. And we see it written in the songs and in the poetry and in the stories, all throughout human history, particularly within our era. And what John Paul II does is he creates what's called a triptych. Have you ever seen an icon that like opens? You know what I'm talking about? Can I get a head nod? Are you alive? Right? A triptych is an icon that has 3 pieces. And what John Paul II does is he develops 2 of these. And the first one, he goes to the Gospel of Matthew. And Matthew's so epic for us because he understands the human heart. And he begins with Matthew 19 with Jesus' interlocutors, aka the Pharisees and Sadducees. And they're trying to trip him up, right? They want to kill Jesus. That's the goal of the Pharisees and Sadducees at this point. They're trying to find a reason for him to disobey or disagree with the Mosaic law so that they can go, all right, kill him, get him out. Because he's gaining power. And John Paul II points out that he looks to Matthew 19 when Jesus is being questioned about marriage and divorce in a particular way. And he says in response to these questions, in the beginning it was not so. And John Paul II uses that moment to jump back to the beginning because he uses the beginning as the measure of man's heart. What are you made for? What's your design? Why do you have the desires you do? John Paul II says, hey, I got the answer for what you've been looking for. If you hear nothing else, hear it said this way. Your desire is by design, and it points to your destiny. That's what TOB does. So he looks to the beginning as the measure of man's heart, and he sets up 3 different aspects. He has original man in the beginning, before the fall, before we screwed it up, right? He has what's called historical man, how we've fallen out of grace and into this life of concupiscence. And then he points in the long run to what's called eschatological man, the man of the end times, the man of heaven. We're going to hang out here for most of our conversation. Original man, what are we made for? What did the beginning tell us about our existence? What does it tell you? What is it meant to instruct you about? He goes through 3 things. He says, in the beginning, man had solitude. Right, that in the beginning, and if you ever have been told to read Genesis as a like literal historical narrative of creation, you've been sold short in the gospel. You've been short. Like, that's not what's going on in Genesis. We're not getting how God created. In a very real way, we're getting why God created. Why did he create man? Why did he give him dominion over everything that's going on? Why is he in solitude amongst the rest of creation? And he begins in that place. That original man has solitude, that he's unlike anything else. I don't think we have to look very far to recognize that you and me are vastly different than our dog. Right? Now, some of you might be more like them than not, but I'm not going to go there. Right? That you're vastly different. There's something about the human heart, the human intellect, free will, choice that sets us apart. And it sets us apart, John Paul II emphasizes, for greatness or for vice. That you don't go home, your dog doesn't get put on trial because it ate your homework. Right? That we are the ones who can choose good or evil, choose virtue or vice. So in that original solitude, original uniqueness, that I am the subject amongst no other subjects, or at least Adam is, that he recognizes he's different. And then John Paul II says, so original man, he's made in God's image and likeness, right? In and of himself, yes, Adam is, but there's something about Adam that's not complete. Right? There's something about Adam that's missing. And so we have the mythological language of Eve being drawn forth from Adam's side as this step of equality, that she's in submission to Adam, but not under. Submissio, under the same mission as her spouse. And so Eve's drawn forth from Adam's side, and something about Eve gives something to Adam, John Paul II emphasizes, that no other Eve could give. Or let me rephrase that. Eve gives something to Adam that no Adam could give to Adam. And he says we got to pay attention to that. That Adam gives something to Eve that no other Eve could give to Eve. And he says in that there's a great lesson. That in their communion, so he goes from solitude to unity, communion. That in the beginning we're created for a reason. That your body by itself doesn't make sense. That the word sex comes from the Latin word sexus, which means difference. And so as Adam looks at bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh, the beautiful poetic language of Genesis, he sees difference, but he sees a homogeneity, as John Paul II calls it, that we're the same in a certain sense too. But Eve gives to Adam, and God gives us explicit instructions. I love when the Lord does this in Scripture because it takes the idiot context out, right? Read it, get it right, idiot. That's how I read it sometimes, right? God has put the instructions word for word. What are they supposed to do? Be therefore fruitful and multiply. Fill the earth and subdue it. Right? So we see in this original unity what that difference is meant for. And this is where sometimes TOB gets sold short as just some instruction regarding human sexuality and what we shouldn't do with our bodies. It's more than that. It's about who am I? And what is that self-gift that I'm making to the other tell me? See, in the beginning, when God creates man, he says, let us make man in our image, after our likeness. And in a certain sense, Adam is in the image of God. But in a very real sense, too, Adam and Eve together make that image. And how so? Why is it that the church teaches, gentlemen? You want to pay attention? Thanks. I don't mind calling you out, I'm a teacher. There's something that's happening in the beginning between the two of them. The rest of you are just laughing at that, which is fine. In the beginning, there's something about that exchange between the two that communicates greatness, communicates meaning, communicates fulfillment, and echoes the Trinity. Did you realize that? That your mom and dad reflect the Trinity? That's what you're made to do, is reflect God. So how? Well, the Trinity exists clearly outside of space and time. And forever, for all of eternity, God the Father is pouring himself out as self-gift. And the Son is receiving the Father's self-gift and giving it right back to him. And for all of eternity, that exchange of love is the third person, the Holy Spirit. And in a very real way, Adam gives himself to Eve and draws her to God in that gift. And Eve gives herself, it's reciprocal self-gift, as John Paul II calls it, gives herself back to Adam. And 9 months later, they got to name that self-gift. That in that, they reflect the Trinity. There's something immensely beautiful about that. But John Paul II doesn't end there. He says, hey, the reason they're able to reflect the divine in that place, in that space, is because of grace. That's really hard in the beginning for them to get it right. It's really hard for us to get it right. Not because our bodies are bad by any stretch of the imagination, but because they're so good. John Paul II, in speaking about pornography, says it's not that it reveals too much, it's that it reveals too little. That the whole of humanity is not seen when we take the body out of context. That the whole of the meaning of you don't cover yourself up in the bathroom when somebody barges in on you because you're bad. Sorry, don't come in, I'm bad, this is evil. No, you cover because it's good. Or we start to sell our bodies because they're so good. We start to give away pieces of who I am to another so as to get love from another. So John Paul II, as he talks about original man, he says, we have this mistake and we fall from grace and we lose original innocence. And man is no longer, Adam's no longer able to see Eve without shame. Right? That lack of shame in the beginning was access. Adam had full access to Eve. Who are those friends that you have access to? And I don't mean in the physical way, right? But who allows you to see them? And who do you allow to see you? Maybe it's those people who follow your Finsta. Maybe it's those people who you have that Snapchat streak going for over a year, right? That see the ridiculous faces you make. It's so funny as a teacher when I'm looking around my room and somebody looks down and is like, you don't make those kind of faces at your hip. What are you doing? But who gets to see you for who you really are? Because that's the nakedness without shame that Genesis is talking about. Who gets to look in and encounter you in the good things, and in the bad, in sickness, eventually, and in health? Both shout hard. Eventually, John Paul II goes to Matthew chapter 5, and he says, all right, we got original man, and then man crashes and burns, screws up all of Israel's history, is like, hey, we get it right, hey, we've crashed, hey, we get it right, hey, we've crashed and burned, again and again and again. And in Matthew 5, Jesus is saying, hey, you've been doing second grade math. I want to call you to do calculus, right? You've been an elementary baseball player. I've been giving you little instructions. Don't do this, don't do that. 10 commandments. And he steps up his game in Matthew 5, says, hey, blessed are those who are persecuted. Blessed are the pure of heart. And he steps up his game and says, hey, I want to take you from elementary school to the major leagues. I want to take you from this call to debauchery, licentiousness, lust, use, and raise you up. And so the way he does that, what John Paul II calls for, is he recognizes that in mankind's heart, in Matthew chapter 5, that we've been grasping instead of receiving. That we've been trying to take from others instead of receiving what they're willing to give. How often is this the story in our hallways and amongst relationships in high schools, right? That girls give sex so that might receive love, or what looks like love. And how often are the men, the boys in our schools, giving love so they can get sex. So they can grasp or take instead of waiting to fully receive. That exchange of their bodies might echo something true. Now, I'm not here to shame you if that's the place that you're in, by any means. But I want you to recognize it. Where have you given up on grace and turned to shame? Where have you given up on grace and said, you know what, I know this is hard, and this is what John Paul II does in the second part of this triptych icon, is he uses Matthew chapter 5 and says, hey, why don't we all just recognize how hard this is? Why don't we recognize the difficulty that God has called us to in the beginning? That making it to the major leagues, to eschatological man in the end, is going to be hard. See, John Paul II came up with this work that we call TOB in response to Humanae Vitae, which is the church's response to some difficulties that were going on about 40 years prior. And he's saying, hey, in no other area in life do we say, it's too hard, so I'm not going to do it. Right? If you're an athlete, as most of you are, if you're an athlete, when things get hard, it's because there's an actual challenge. Right? When you're standing up, when I'm standing facing the Auburn University pitcher and I have a 3-1 count, and she nails me in the ribs and I have another chance to go up to bat, I don't go up to bat because it was easy. I don't go up to bat because I'm like, hey, like this is a fun thing I like to do on the weekends, right? I trained and I worked my butt off so I could do something great. So I could get a hit off of a future Olympian. Where else in life? If you're a dancer, you don't, when you can't get the steps, you don't just give up and throw up in the towel and be like, it's not worth it. We push through the hard things, the suckiness, for things that we're passionate about, for things that we believe are worth it. And John Paul II is looking at man and saying, hey, this is going to be hard. You're called to perpetual self-gift. No greater love has man than this than to lay down his life for his friend. And he calls man out. Says it's going to be hard. But that echo in you has not died. Right? John Paul II says, that thing in you that longs for greatness is that echo of original man. That thing in you that goes, I'm worthy of sacrificial love. I'm worthy of somebody who's going to lay down their life for me. Not just a God who's going to do it, but your spouse who should be the closest thing you have to a reflection of God himself. If you're dating somebody who's not sacrificing for you, it's never going to reflect the Trinity. If you're dating someone who doesn't know how to tell their own desires at times no, then it's never, or it's going to be very, very difficult for that to ever reflect the Trinity in the bond of marriage. But John Paul II says, hey, this is hard, so let me give you some tips. And I think over the next 2 weeks, you're going to have some speakers who come in and share personally how they've journeyed out this teaching, right, or journeyed through this teaching, and what practical tips they have. But John Paul II says there's a couple. He says the heroism of man has not been totally snuffed out, that there's still an echo. And we have to fan into flame. I don't know if any of you are campers or hikers, but when a fire is just about out, right, and the embers have gone, they're not even red anymore, right? There's still potential for things to be set ablaze. It just needs to be fanned into flame. It just needs to be breathed upon. Inspirare, right? The Holy Spirit breathes ruah upon humanity once again. And so as we turn to God and ask him to fan these things into flame, they reteach us how to make a sacrificial gift of ourselves to another. He says this, that the heart is now a battlefield between love and lust. It says, in order to reach eschatological man in the end, so we got it right, and we crashed and burned, but we're made for something greater than the beginning. St. Thomas Aquinas speaks of it as, oh, happy fault. Right? That we're not going back to the beginning, that we're going beyond the beginning. And what he says is, in us, there's a battlefield, and we have to take up battle. I have to come to my own fight. If you want to be a saint, you got to show up. You have to. How often are you just waiting for the rest of the world to get in line and to figure out their stuff, and you're like, I'll just be a decent human. Jesus didn't call you to be a decent human. He called you to be a saint. He called you to be a saint. And he calls us to fan that echo into flame. The way in which he does it, he says man needs to learn with perseverance and consistency. Perseverance and consistency. Just as when I was in college and on the softball field, again and again, I would hit until my hands bled through my batting gloves so I could get it right, so I could get that hit against that future Olympian. That I have to with perseverance and consistency. When you crash and burn when it comes to TOB, don't just give up. Oh, well, I messed up with this guy or that girl. Whatever. right? Just throw in the towel. No, perseverance and consistency. Right? If you fall on your face, literally, as a dancer, you're not just going to stay on the floor. You're going to get up and do it again and again and again. He also says, I got about 2 more things and then we'll be done. That man is called to authentic conversion in an interior paradigm shift. John Paul II says we got to look at the world with new eyes. With eyes that are more hopeful than anyone in humanity has ever looked at them with. Right? That we got to look at the rest of the world with the potential that they have, not with the crap that they're stuck in. So he calls every single one of us to that fundamental shift in the heart. That the heart is the measure of the man. That's why Matthew chapter 5, he harps on it so much. And he says, I have to stand in holiness and reverence of the gift of the other. How often do we have that moment? I'm not a dude, so I don't know. I can only imagine what it's like to be a dude. But how often is there that moment presented to us where our friend's vulnerable? How do I respond to that gift? How do I respond to them kind of unveiling that moment or allowing me to see them? Do I see it as someone who's set apart like a child of God? And do I reverence it? Do I reverence those difficult places that I encounter with another? Right? Do I give them what is due to them? Or do I mock it? Do I put it down? And with your potential one day beloved, reverence also calls us to not rush the gift. Right? That reverence waits for the right time. Reverence doesn't take, reverence receives. Reverence doesn't grasp. Right? You don't go to Christmas and take things out of your parents' closet. You go to the Christmas tree and you receive them when they're already there. I know we all totally looked at children. Right? Totally found them in our parents' closet or under their bed or whatever it might be. But reverence doesn't rush the gift. Reverence doesn't rush the gift. So, what is TOB in one sentence? It's God recognizing what you were made for and calling you to the greatness of heaven. God recognizing you and what you were made for and calling you to the greatness of heaven. So I hope over these next 2 weeks, I have a good friend who's going to come share with you guys next week, who's named Nick. I hope that you can live this out. I hope you can dive into the truth of your creation.